Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special event. You're here, of course, to hear Kyriakos Mitsotakis. We've agreed a slightly different format than usual. You want to talk to him, he wants to talk to you, so we're proposing a much more interactive format. Kindly, he has agreed that we go straight to a conversation. He and I are going to have a conversation shortly on stage, and then we will give plenty of time for Q&A with you from the audience. So hopefully this will meet many different interests rather than having the formal lecture. There may be some of you in the room who may not actually know Kyriakos Mitsotakis so well. So let me say one or two brief words of introduction. Kyriakos Mitsotakis has been leader of New Democracy, the centre-right party in Greece, since January 2016. He was previously under Antonis Samaras, Prime Minister. He was Minister for Administrative Reform and E-Governance. His education, he's a graduate of Athens College, Harvard University, and Stanford University. Sadly, not the London School of Economics. But he seems to be intellectually robust to survive that loss of his personal career trajectory. Of course, we're looking forward to hearing what he's got to say. Before we start, can you please join me in giving a very warm LSE welcome to Kyriakos Mitsotakis. I should just double check that the microphones are working, and at the back you can hear us, yes? Very good. There is silence, so you probably can't even hear the question. We seem to be sat in a rather more intimate fashion than I'd expected, but it's fine. It's fine. So we're going to have a conversation to elaborate a number of ideas. Perhaps for an international audience, the first question might be, in your situation, since you've been leader of the party, you've been ahead in the opinion polls. The opinion polls now give you something like a 20 percentage point lead. But I just wonder whether at the moment you would wish there to be early elections, or whether you would prefer to come to power later, after the present government has introduced some very unpopular austerity measures, and whether you would simply prefer to sit back and smile and watch them introduce austerity measures, the like of which they were previously opposing. Wouldn't you prefer an election in a year's time, 2 years' time?
You did start by asking a tricky question. First of all, let me thank you for this invitation, and thank you all for attending and for this very impressive full house. Let me correct you and remind you that I did spend a semester at the London School of Economics as an exchange student back in 1988, at a time when it was still rather unusual for students from the US to come over to the UK, and I had a great time. I still remember I took a course in public choice, which was actually my first experience with sort of decision-making theory, and I very much appreciated the fact that you actually had no exams during the first semester, which made my stay very, very pleasant. But it's great to be back 29 years later. So let me jump straight to the question. The answer is no. I've been calling for an early election since last April because I have a fundamental central premise that the longer this government stays in power, the more underlying damage will be done to the economy. And unfortunately, what we currently see happening in Greece seems to vindicate my approach. It took the government 15 months to complete the second review. We're faced with a very heavy austerity package, which in our mind was completely unnecessary. We have fiscal measures for 2019, 2020, which were not part of the third program. So essentially what we have is a fourth program without additional funding. At the same time, the economy is back in a recession. We saw no growth in 2016. 2017 has been a bad year so far. And my fear is that the more time we lose, the more we pretend that we are reforming, the more we pretend that we're negotiating, but just keeping sort of our internal factions happy, the more damage will be done to the country. On the economic front, I also have a major issue with what's happening on other aspects of policy, which are less frequently discussed in the public domain. Reforms in education have been rolled back. Our healthcare system is almost collapsing. Clientelistic politics are returning in public administration. A lot of the reforms that I tried to implement have also been rolled back. And there has been what I consider an unacceptable level of intervention in justice and in media. So overall, if I consider the balance to be negative, my interest is to try to have an election as quickly as possible. Obviously, we've made it very clear from the beginning that we cannot impose an election, but that does not mean that we're not going to call for one, and we're not going to be making the case that the quicker we have a political change, the less likely it is that we'll break out of this vicious cycle in which we found ourselves.
Okay. The title of our discussion begins with the words defeating populism. And obviously, in preparation for our conversation, we were looking at statements you've made, statements the party's made. A little while ago, you were accusing Syriza of being, quote, corrupt with the Savidis affair. This weekend, the party's spokesman, Vasilis Kikilias, was talking about Syriza having put Greece in the hands of the IMF, handing over Greece to the IMF. Sounds a bit populist to me.
Oh, I missed that statement.
Okay.
No, I'm joking. Look, I've been making a very strong argument against populism since I basically entered politics in 2004. When I talk about populism, I envision sort of an attitude towards politics which sort of greatly simplifies problems, which always places the burden for what's happening to the country on someone outside the country, appealing to raw emotions, dividing rather than uniting, and looking inwards rather than looking outwards. So in my mind, distinctions between the populists from the right and from the left are not that significant. And I do think that there is a central cleavage in politics today, which is not so much the cleavage between the right and the left, but the cleavage between what we call populism and what we would call sort of moderate liberal rationalism. And I think the best evidence that this is the case is the fact that in Greece, we should not forget, we have a coalition of a party that started as a radical left, governing with a party that is clearly to the right of Dimokratia. So that's why I make this case that populism, regardless of where it comes from, is problematic. Now, we have been making a convincing case that we need to tell people the truth. By telling people the truth, obviously there is never an absolute truth, but if we want to restore trust and a level of honesty, you have, first of all, to start by accepting what the real problem is, taking an honest view at the mirror and look at your own reflection, and then come up with reasonable, sometimes complicated solutions to complicated problems. So in my mind, that is the fundamental distinction between what Tsipras did when he was in the opposition and what we're doing now.
But if you had been giving a speech here tonight, presumably you wouldn't have used the phrase that the current government is handing Greece over to the IMF.
Well, no, I would not have used that phrase, but I would have made the point that the way the government has dealt with the IMF in its own way is very populist in nature. Why am I saying that? The IMF has been making some correct arguments about the fact that we need lower primary surpluses and a bigger intervention on the debt side. But because we always need a villain in Greece, and because the government needed a villain, it did not take advantage of the fact that some of the positions of the IMF were actually aligned with Greek interests. Having said that, if you look at the agreement, it's the IMF that calls the shots now regarding the future projections of the Greek economy. So if the IMF doesn't agree on the sort of forward projections of what will happen, nothing can really happen with regards to the famous countermeasures that Mr. Tsipras is in the process of legislating. And just to explain to those of you who are not very familiar with what is currently being legislated in Greece, we have a program that's coming to an end in 2018, and we have the strange situation where we're being asked to legislate now fiscal measures for 2019 and 2020, post-program fiscal measures of 2% of GDP. 1% in pension cuts, 1% in additional revenue by lowering the tax threshold. The government has come up with this notion of countermeasures, which basically means that if we exceed the target of the primary surplus by 2%, that is, if we achieve a primary surplus of 5.5%, we can take 2% of additional fiscal countermeasures to bring down the primary surplus to 3.5%. Now, who believes that we can produce primary surplus of 5.5%? That is still a big question. So in our mind, the measures will be implemented. The countermeasures will probably never be implemented. Hence, we will have a package that is very painful fiscally. And in our mind, I will keep on making this point, a package that was completely unnecessary. No one actually asked us to take these measures 6 to 8 months ago. But there is a cost you pay when you delay, when you pretend that you're negotiating, when you lose credibility. And, in my mind, this is the most important argument, when you're not committed to reforms. As long as the government is not committed to real reforms, we will be asked for additional fiscal austerity. And that is the wrong recipe for Greece.
And you think in the short term, the IMF will help Greece to have a debt write-off? Do you think there's a new deal on the debt in the coming months to be had?
Well, the IMF is most probably going to be joining the program with a one-year program until the end of the current program. So there will be a one-year IMF program with limited funding until August 2018.
That's a success.
There will be something on the debt side. Having said that, there is some blame to be placed on our creditors for not offering Greece a solution on the debt side earlier, because the initial commitment that something additional needs to be done with the Greek debt was made in November 2012. If and when something happens on the debt side, it's probably better late than never, but it's something which should have happened earlier. Obviously, the situation, the public finances have deteriorated significantly over the past 2 years, so you need sort of a bigger intervention on the debt side, but we more or less know what this would entail. We know what is and what isn't acceptable for our creditors. But for me, the most important parameter, and as I'm speaking to a group that I'm sure also includes economists, after all, I am at the London School of Economics, in my mind has to do with the commitment that Mr. Tsipras has basically assumed that Greece will need to produce primary surpluses of 3.5% for the foreseeable future, for many years. This is highly problematic, and you will not find many trained economists, even within your faculty, who will make the case that an economy with the characteristics of Greece can produce primary surpluses of 3.5% for many years. And that, in my mind, is the essence of the problem. And this is what I will try to convince our creditors that they need to change. How can I do that? Only if I make a credible case on the reform side. Only if a government that comes into power openly embraces the structural reforms that are actually included in the third and the fourth program, and also adds some on top of that, because I don't think that the whole reform agenda is complete. So I think the grand deal that you referred to is a grand deal of trading real reforms for a little bit of fiscal space.
Okay. Perhaps we could come back to that in a moment, but of course the Prime Minister in China this weekend seems to have had a very positive meeting with the head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, and they've both spoken about the need for debt relief for Greece in order to return to growth. In that press conference, the Prime Minister said that if the debt relief was not forthcoming, and if the IMF was to step aside from the adjustment programme, then Greece should not implement the current reform measures. You're saying to the Greek people, these measures are necessary anyway.
No, I'm not saying that. Not at all. First of all, if Mr. Tsipras really meant what he said, he should have included this provision in the law. He has not done that. So there is no conditionality in the current piece of legislation. It's nice talking about these things, but when it comes to what is actually voted in Parliament, we're talking about something different. No, I'm saying the opposite. That these fiscal measures are imposing an additional unnecessary level of austerity on Greece. And even if you look at measures such as the broadening of the tax base, which one could, in theory, argue is in the right direction, it's very difficult to accept that you have an introductory marginal tax rate of 22% for people who earn an income of 6,000 or 7,000 euros. So you're imposing a lot of pain on poor people with very limited income. And there's an irony here that Tsipras came to power by claiming, Tsipras basically said three things. He's going to tear up the memorandum and he's going to finish with austerity. We have cumulatively almost 14 billion of additional austerity measures since Mr. Tsipras came into power. He said that he would not legislate measures that go beyond the end of the current program. He has legislated measures that go beyond the end of the current program. And he always said that, look, we are here to protect the weakest. We are a government of the left, and we care about the weakest in Greek society. It's the weakest that are actually being punished by his policies. So all the myths really have been dispelled. What's left is a government that is trying to make some sort of U-turn. And now we hear Mr. Tsipras talk a lot about the need to attract investment and about how important it is to talk to foreign investors and bring them to Greece. Well, I cannot say better late than never, but what I will say is that at the same time when he's making these statements, his own party is undermining most of the important foreign investments that actually take place or are in the process of being implemented in Greece. So there is still, unless you have a government that is 100% committed to the reform agenda, that has a strong public mandate to implement these reforms, that is clearly pro-business, liberal, and interested in attracting foreign capital, we will not generate the level of investment that is necessary to create jobs and to help some of these young people, because I'm sure we also have a lot of Greeks in our audience, to hope that at some point they will come back to Greece and find a decent job. It's not going to happen with this government.
Okay. If I was a Greek voter, I'd have thought so much of your strategy depends on whether you personally will have more credibility with European partners, and the European partners would give you somehow a better deal than the current Prime Minister. You've also just spoken about building up the credibility through structural reform. Do you have any indication at all that Chancellor Merkel, other European leaders, basically have more faith in you than Alexis Tsipras?
Well, what I can tell you is that I'm someone who has been extremely consistent in what I say and what I have done so far in my political career. I was Minister of Administrative Reform. I had a very thankless task of downsizing the public administration and tried to implement real reforms. Some reforms I didn't necessarily agree with, but I did try to implement a lot of real reforms, and some of them were actually quite successful. So I have a track record. And my public statements have always been pro-reform. And I was elected leader of New Democracy through a sort of grassroots movement because I made the case for real reforms against all odds and against most people, most pundits who thought I never had a chance. But I made my case for reforms at least to the New Democracy base. A lot of people came and voted for me. a lot of people did not belong to New Democracy and came and registered to the party.
Yes.
And voted for me. I got very impressive numbers, by the way, in London in the first and the second round.
We noticed that, and that was the cause of the invitation.
I think that there's a change. There's a change of attitudes in Greece. I think, in spite of the pain and the suffering and the anger and all the negative emotions, people understand that growth is only going to come from the private sector. That we need private investment, that we should probably aspire to a smaller, more efficient state, but we also need to pay lower taxes. So it's my job to basically express this change which is really happening in Greece.
Okay. At the moment, your brand is tremendously popular. Kyriakos is more popular than the party, and the party is more popular than the opposition. But I wonder, many of my Greek friends who might identify in the political center of the spectrum say, yeah, Kyriakos is tremendously able. He hasn't been to the LSE, but he's been to Harvard. And he says all of the right things. We like what he says, etc. The problem is the party that he leads. And I wonder to what extent you are an agent of change for your own party. A number of people say to me, I'd have much more faith in Kyriakos if he had already shown that he was changing near Dimokratia now when he's 20 percentage points ahead in the polls.
Well, I'll tell you that we've done a lot to change the Dimokratia. We had our Congress, we changed our bylaws, we elected new grassroots members. 70% of our grassroots party leaders are new. We even symbolically moved offices and saved 80% of our rent by symbolically moving to a poorer part of Athens. But the most important aspect is that we have made several open calls to people to actually come and tell us how they want to help us. And the most recent call that we made, which is the most important one, we have already interviewed more than 900 people who have openly expressed an interest in helping us in some way. Some of these people actually want to present themselves as candidates in the next election. Some want to help from a technocratic position. Some may be aspiring to a job in government after the next elections. But this is something which is unprecedented. It has never happened in a major party. A lot of, there's some reaction within the party, but I've made a very clear commitment that I will significantly renew the party list for the next elections. Obviously, all MPs automatically have a position on the list, but there's still a lot of room to bring in new people and foster more competition. And I can tell you, there are a lot of people who are making the case to me and to the party committee that will make this decision that they actually deserve a position on the list. So you should not look at what's necessarily happening now, but what will happen after the elections and how different the parliamentary group will be. Having said that, one of the big challenges, and we need to speak openly about that, has to do with how do we attract young talent to politics in general. It's not easy to make a case today that one should engage in politics, especially at a time when there is little trust and when there's a lot of cynicism. But we need to make a case, especially to the younger generation, that political involvement needs to go beyond just participating in elections. And you have a lot of, I'm sure, a lot of talented people here that care passionately about Greece. And what I want is to give them an opportunity through a meritocratic system to offer their services. The truth is that the traditional parties tended to be rather tribal. You needed to be connected to someone to hope that you have a chance to rise through the sort of party hierarchy. I want to break that, and I will break that, because at least the people, especially the younger people who want to get engaged in politics, deserve to be judged on their own merit. So I would argue that we've made a lot of changes. There's still a lot to be done. and especially if we have time until the next elections, we will move much more aggressively in that direction, and we will actively recruit also outside, the confines of the center right. And I've also made another pledge that if I have the privilege of being elected prime minister, I will form a cabinet that will also include a substantial number of people who are going to be joining politics for the first time and who will be outsiders, business people or people from academia who have something to offer, and who are not sort of traditional politicians.
Okay, no, that sounds very good. It would be, I take the point that 900 people may be wishing to be on the party list, and you wish to promote meritocracy and a new style of politics. So presumably between now and the next election, if there was any evidence that any of these candidates were engaging in clientelistic ristretti politics, you would say goodbye.
We've done that already. I don't want to go into. We've had some pretty hilarious cases of some candidates really exceeding the limits of what is acceptable, and we made it very clear that if you do that, you're out. Okay. Obviously, this is not going to be 100% success, but everybody knows the sort of qualities that I reward and that I'm looking for. And it's not engaging in traditional clientelistic politics.
Okay.
That's not part of the job description.
Okay, perhaps we can move to your ideas, and you've touched on some of these points already. Of course, you come from a very long tradition of liberal politics in Greece. And I wonder what the term liberal means to you. Neoliberal, of course, in the Greek context, has been really rather a controversial term, not necessarily the word to use to win hearts and minds. I wonder what is your liberalism?
I think I'm a liberal in the classical sense of the sort of liberalism that young students get taught here at the LSE, looking at the sort of liberal tradition of 19th century UK political thinkers. Someone who believes in the premise of the concept of freedom, who believes that individuals have both rights but also responsibilities. Who believes that we need overall a smaller state that messes less with people's lives, but a state that is also efficient at doing what it should be doing. So rather than doing lots of things poorly, it should do a few things rather well. I don't believe that markets always get it right, because they don't, and we know that is the case. But I also believe that we need to be very careful what and how we regulate, and that in Greece quite frequently we have over-regulated markets simply because we wanted to protect special interest groups. And that in my mind is not compatible with my sort of liberal approach. But mostly I believe in the concept that people need to have equal opportunities at the beginning of their lives, and then everyone is going to proceed according to their own skills and capacities. But if we talk about equal opportunities, we should start by talking about education. And there is very little serious debate in Greece about education. We talk a lot about universities, but we don't talk about nursery schools. We don't talk about primary schools. We don't talk about the fact that our schools are in a mess right now. That if you look at the curricula of what we teach kids, it has nothing to do with the sorts of skills that they will need in 10, 12, 15 years when they become adults. So in my mind, the most meaningful liberal reform is a bold reform of public education that really creates good schools, especially for those underprivileged kids that cannot afford a private education.
Okay, so a liberal education presumably would mean, to take one example, the influence of the church on the school curriculum would be less at the end of your period of office.
Well, I've actually openly discussed the need to redesign θρησκευτικά, because I've quite frequently, I have a daughter who's 14, and I sometimes manage to find time to sort of review her work, and it doesn't make any sense what I read in these books. But at the end of the day, we do need to respect the role of the church in Greek history, and you can do that by also talking to the church. You don't have to fight the church simply to assess your leftist credentials, because that's exactly what a lot of the Syriza ministers did. You can make changes to the curriculum in good faith.
Absolutely, but presumably that would be multiple faiths. Greece is becoming increasingly multicultural, and children would learn that there are other faiths.
Of course, you need to teach also, other faiths and other religions. That is only natural, and Greece is to a certain extent changing. That is true, but it's far from becoming a multicultural society.
Yeah.
And it is still a country that is basically ethnically homogeneous. That has a Muslim minority in Thrace, in northeastern Greece. In spite of the difficulties, it's a minority that has been relatively well assimilated, and people still they feel that they're Greek citizens with equal rights, maybe not the sort of opportunities that they should have, but certainly compared to what we see in other European countries, we don't have these sort of cases in Greece.
Certainly, of course, your father, with the Muslims in Western Thrace, undertook.
Yeah, because he was the one who
was
in 1990 offered what we called isonomia and isopolitia, basically equal right of law for all Greek citizens, because we have a Muslim minority of Greek citizens, and they were not offered equal rights and equal opportunities until the beginning of the 90s.
I suspect I should speed up and just ask a few last questions. So, liberal in the sense of the state being smaller in the economy, so presumably public administration would be smaller, there would be fewer public servants.
Yes, but not by firing people, but through a very well calculated and calibrated rule of attrition, by which we would just hire significantly fewer people than retire, and by aggressively outsourcing services that the public sector provides to the private sector. We need a better level of cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. And there are lots of functions that are currently performed by the state that should not necessarily be performed by the state. I've been making the case quite frequently. This, what I say, is misrepresented by the government, but I will stick by my point that we do not need to hire cleaning personnel as permanent personnel in the Greek public administration. That does not mean we're going to fire the existing cleaning personnel, but we don't need to hire new ones, because this is a typical service that you normally outsource to the private sector. Why can't we involve the private sector more in the provision of healthcare? Why can't we involve the private sector, for example, through a project that will provide online ticketing for our archaeological sites? So public-private partnerships, which I'm a big believer in, need to go beyond just building schools, which is what has happened, to also the provision of services through long-term contracts that will provide services more effectively and free up resources of civil servants whom you can retrain and use them elsewhere. So in my mind, there is significant scope to rationalize the role and the footprint of the state. And of course, there's still significant scope to reduce the level and the amount of bureaucracy, especially through e-government and basic sort of rapid simplification processes. We're not sort of inventing the wheel here. There's a lot of good examples of what you can do to make the life of citizens, but also businesses, simpler.
All governments, especially in Europe, have to somehow balance questions of reducing taxation, increasing competitiveness, attracting FDI with the social dimension, welfare support. I was reading that something like 35% of Greeks currently are either at or below the poverty level. And I just wonder, you've said a lot about the need to attract FDI, to make the economy more competitive, more business friendly. And I can certainly see the logic of that. But I wonder what you're saying to those who are at or below the poverty line, whether you're saying to them, wait, growth is just around the corner, or whether you're saying in the transitional period, government will do more to support your plight, your poverty.
I'd say two things. First of all, it was a Dimokratia government that first introduced the minimum guaranteed income scheme, which is generally considered to be the most effective tool in at least alleviating extreme poverty. It's being rolled out after a lot of delays by the current government. We support it, and it should be fully funded. At the same time, there are still pockets of inefficiency in terms of numerous handouts that nobody really understood how they worked, and essentially ended up benefiting people who did not really had the need for public support. So I'm in favor of rigorous means testing and actually offering to those who are in greater need the resources that they require. But at the end of the day, the only way to escape the poverty trap is through jobs. And our agenda is basically about, if you ask me what is your agenda about, it's about jobs. That's, at the end of the day, that's how we will be, we will judge and jobs does not just mean, attracting investment and growing sectors of the economy. It also means skills and continuous training and retraining people in the sort of skills that will be required in those sectors that we will be competitive. We have a big shift of people that return to agricultural production, especially a lot of younger people. And that's very encouraging because a lot of these people are extremely innovative. We have fantastic high-quality agricultural products, and we can significantly improve the productivity of the agricultural sector through technology. But somebody's got to teach these people the basics. You need a lot of sort of very focused vocational short-term training. You need certifications to be much more aggressive, and we need to make much better use of EU funds because there's a ton of money available. There was a ton of money available in the past. I'm afraid most of it was wasted. There's nothing really to show. And of course, this is not just a Greek problem. Sort of lifelong education is a constant. Yes. It's a global problem. It's a problem you're also addressing here at the school. It's not an easy nut to crack, but it's not just about giving people, a 500 euro monthly sort of cash payment. It's more than that. It's much more than that because at some point you won't be able to pay them, this for life. So and there have been some very innovative programs, some of them actually funded by important Greek foundations that take a more holistic approach, look at the families in need and then focus a lot on vocational training. And of course, if we offer you a job and you don't accept it for whatever reason, it's difficult to make the case that we should continue to support one financially.
Okay. My last question. You've spoken of different ideas. It looks as if there won't be an early election. You've got time to speak to the Greek people, to offer a narrative. Successful leaders especially who are 20 percentage points ahead in the opinion polls, often talk about a big idea, a connecting theme, not simply a list of items of reforms they wish to make, but they encapsulate it in a set idea. Clinton said, "I still believe in a place called Hope," for example. People could buy into that. So between now and the next election, as you speak to the Greek and international audience, what would be the strapline? What's the connecting theme, the big idea, which they would associate with Kyriakos rather than predecessors or alternatives?
Well, the goal is very straightforward. Hopefully the next government is going to be the government that will lead Greece out of this mess, and hopefully, by the time we sort of celebrate our 200 years of independence, we will be able to look at the future with much greater optimism, because at the end of the day, it's about putting confidence back in people's sort of souls, and a belief that we can get out of this crisis. But also, for me, the most important word is trust. There is no trust in Greece today. There's no trust. There's very limited trust. Even and I take all these poll numbers with a grain of salt, and I don't get carried over by polls, because I know they can always change. But there is a problem with trust. We don't trust our institutions. We don't trust politicians. We don't trust each other. So, and this is a very, very difficult problem to address. So for me, this is probably the most important theme. It may sound a little sort of romantic, but unless we establish, a trust in political leadership that will speak the truth, do its best to deliver, receive a clear mandate, and not say one thing and do the complete opposite. I mean, how can you have trust when somebody sort of promises to rip up the programs and assign 2 programs in 2 years? So it's difficult to make the case that we should trust politicians. And of course, at the end of the day, it's very subtle. We're not all the same in politics, but it's up to people to decide that this is the case. So talking a lot about basic values, the sort of discussion that we previously had, this balance between rights and responsibilities, the idea that freedom and solidarity are the 2 main sort of ideological themes upon which we build our platform, I think are important in Greece. So I'm open to having this sort of ideological debate. I don't think it's fuzzy. I think it's very important in a country that at some point went bankrupt because it got its priorities and its values wrong. And a lot of this is also educational in nature, and I talk a lot to young people about why I think these values are important. But this is not just about the transactional aspect of policy. Of course, you need policy expertise, but at the end of the day, we're also politicians. And interestingly enough, the Greek language is so rich, yet it does not make the distinctions between politics and policy. It does not exist. It's just politiki in Greece. But we need to do both. We need to both have policy expertise, but we need to be able to sell a big vision, quote unquote, to convince people about our vision and create some sort of momentum. If we don't do that, then we won't even get through the starting gate.
Okay, many thanks. I'm pleased that when I turn my head to the audience, I see that most of you are still here.
Yeah.
I should now...
And not asleep, which sometimes is
yes.
seems a common theme in these long lectures.
I haven't been giving them a lecture.
Yeah.
Now is an opportunity to open up to the audience, and there are colleagues, I think, yes, there are colleagues in the red with microphones. Can I invite you to put up your hand, briefly say who you are? There's a large audience, lots of people will want to ask questions, so could you please keep it to questions rather than speeches? There's a colleague right at the very back. You need lots of exercise up there on the right.
Hi, my name is Kostas Megir. I have 2 brief questions, one more on the economics and one on more on the politics side. On the economics, you've talked a lot about trust. There's an issue of trust with our creditors, and many of the reforms that you will have to implement will actually cost money. For example, we really need to reduce the tax burden. Now, we all understand that. Well, many of us understand that. The fruit of such reforms will take a bit of time to transform into growth. So you'll probably have to run a deficit if you're going to do serious reforms. So the first question is, are you confident that you will have enough trust of the creditors to be able to acquire the fiscal space to really reform the things like the tax code or other aspects of the reform that cost money in the transition? Yeah. Now, that's my first question. I also have I was very interested in the populism issue. One of the things that populists do is they deny the facts, and they go for alternative facts. In view of this, what is your position on the prosecution of the director of the Greek statistical agency, who all he did as a crime was actually reveal the depth of the deficit?
Good.
Well, okay. Do you want to answer that now? Or
let's take two questions at a time.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Others, please. Could you take the gentleman here, please?
Hi, my name is Aggelos Aggelou. I'm a PhD student here. Can you offer some concrete steps on how you plan to deal with the migration crisis in Greece, and especially if you can elaborate on what will be the different steps you will take comparing to the current government?
Good, thanks.
Okay,
So
well, those are two. Yeah.
Well, let's take one more, shall we? Okay. And do we have a woman in the audience wanting to ask a question? I'm sorry, yes, straight in front of me here.
Hello, hi, I'm Helen Reid from Reuters News. I was just wondering about your thoughts on Greece returning to the debt market. Do you think that this is something that you envisage in the next few years if you were to be elected, and how do you see the path towards that? Thank you.
Okay, well, let me start by the reverse order. Returning to the debt markets is obviously the fundamental goal if we at some point want to finish with the program. We may, best case scenario, we may be able to sort of try to tap the capital markets in a protected manner, assuming the second review is completed, assuming we have some visibility on the debt side, assuming we get QE. This could actually happen within the next months. But the real question is what's happening after the end of the program. We will need to borrow more than 10 billion, I think it's 13 billion euros in 2019. And the real question is, have we restored the level of credibility to be able to borrow this amount of money at reasonable interest rates? You can always borrow. The question is, how much is it going to cost you? And the jury's still out on that. Again, I have my doubts that the current government can restore this level of confidence to really convince the capital markets that they've actually turned the corner. On the question of migration, that's a very complicated issue. And more than a year ago, we actually, all the political leaders met under the President of the Republic to try to agree on a common strategy towards the migration issue. And we've made it very clear that we don't want to play sort of domestic politics with migration because it's too big a problem to be part of the traditional Greek domestic political debate. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that we have agreed have not really happened. I think the government is still hostage to a lot of its leftist ideological constraints when it thinks about migration. For example, we have been making the case that on the islands you need to be able to separate the refugees from the economic migrants, at least in terms of their initial profile, and you need to keep them sort of in separate facilities, and you need to be rather aggressive with trying to return economic migrants back to their countries of origin. This is something which so far has not really happened. We've been terribly inefficient in absorbing the significant amount of EU funds that have been made available to Greece to deal with the migration problem. We've been terribly inefficient in processing asylum applications from refugees who arrived after the deal with Turkey was put into place. So there are a lot of fundamental inefficiencies in the way we manage the problem that I think could be addressed by a more competent government. Of course, the overall forces and dynamics behind the problem are still going to be there. Greece is still very much dependent on the deal that Europe has signed with Turkey. The deal so far seems to be holding, which obviously is good. We don't really have a plan B. If for whatever reason, relationship between Turkey and EU gets highly problematic, that would affect Turkey's approach to the migration problem. Now, on the question that Kostas asked, first of all, on the Georgiou issue, no further charges have been pressed against Mr. Georgiou, and I fully respect the decisions taken by Greek justice. And my comment is never to comment on issues pertaining to justice, because that can get you in a very treacherous position. On the first part of the question, which is also I think very important. If we stick to primary surplus of 3.5%, it will be difficult to create the necessary fiscal space. I want to be perfectly honest. The Bank of Greece, a lot of serious senior economists have argued that you can actually make the numbers work with primary surplus of 2%, with the reasonable interventions on the debt side that we all know will be accepted to our creditors, especially Germany. But in order for this to happen, you need slightly better growth projections than the one made by the IMF. That's why the reform sort of agenda is so important, because it affects the underlying growth rate. We talk too much about the numerator, the debt, and much less about the denominator, which is the GDP. And that is my concern, and I think that's where we can really convince our creditors that we need to take a different approach. Having said that, there is still room to create some fiscal space on the spending side. And we've put forward specific proposals on where we think there is still sort of additional fat within the administration. It's not unlimited, but we can squeeze out a sum that is not insignificant in order to start cutting taxes, and then sort of hopefully we will generate a sort of positive growth. I'm not a true believer in the sort of absolute logic of supply side economics. In the short term, you always have sort of a shortfall in revenue when you cut taxes. But if we manage to break out of the sort of low growth trap we find ourselves in, and if we combine that with aggressive measures to tackle tax evasion, which basically mean in my mind two things: a well-staffed independent revenue agency that can do very specific targeted audits on high-risk individual or corporates for tax evasion, and very aggressively pushing electronic payments to significantly reduce the dependence on the economy on cash, which is an issue I fundamentally and firmly believe in. You can actually have additional revenues through the ability to address tax evasion more effectively. But you're right to point out, at the end of the day, the fiscal space needs to be provided through some sort of new grand bargain with our creditors.
Okay, so more questions. Could we take the gentleman in the very center here, please? Yeah, if you could just keep your hand up, please.
Hello, good evening. My name is Yorgos Kordelas. We talked a lot about hard facts, about restructuring debt, surpluses, etc., all the economic growth that will hopefully come with you as a prospect of being the new Greek Prime Minister. When are we starting telling us, the Greeks, when are you going to start telling us, the Greeks, that the bigger issue, which are long-term, is that we need to change our attitude in allocating our favors to family, friends, etc. And this is a thing that probably will take 1, 2, 3, how many generations? And I think now is the time, is a window of opportunity, I think, for you to address this issue, because in my view, we haven't done that. I haven't heard it from you or from your party or from any other politician. We haven't told us Greeks that we are partly to blame, and it's not only the Troika or the Germans to blame. And I think this is very important, because this is a long-term issue. So my question is, do you agree that this is an issue? And when are you going to start, and how are you going to convince the Greeks, us Greeks, to change?
Okay, thanks. And then could we take the lady here, please? If you could just put your hand up again. Thanks.
Good evening and welcome to London. I was a big fan of your dad, and I was participating in his campaigns when he was Prime Minister many years ago. So it's great luck to have you here tonight. I will ask you one simple thing as soon as I can.
Could you say who you are, please?
Yes, my name is Kyriakos Mitsotakis. I'm a doctor. I'm GP with special interest in cardiology and quite active in this community. I left the country many years ago because of lack of meritocracy, and that hurts a lot. I achieved a lot here, thank God. I'm happy for that. I earn a lot, but I miss my country. We discussed a lot about brain drain. We are accused that we abandoned the country to come and work here for more money. It's not a lie. But as a young politician, I would ask you directly, looking directly to my face and to many other people of my age, why should we come back? How are you going to have a life of dignity? Getting paid less than here, but it doesn't matter. But can we still live? Because a doctor gets paid less than 1,000 euros per month, which is really poor. And if you look at me, how could you make me, or how could you convince me to go back to my country, which I really miss, and I want to offer more than here? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And could we take the lady in the very centre, just here, please? No, if you can come forward, here.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Anna Crony, member of LSE Alumni. We talked about a lot about the current and short-term future. Would you be able to describe two scenarios for Greece in 2050? What would
when?
In 2050, what would be the political, socio-economic situation 30 years from now?
Good heavens. Okay, very good.
Simple question.
I think the first part of the answer is that I would not be here, but anyway.
No.
Okay, so...
let me take these three
yeah.
The only institution I know that runs economic models until 2050 is the IMF, and I don't put much faith in those predictions. Look, no, I can't, frankly, because you're pushing me to look way into the future. What I do know, however, is that there is we are facing huge transformation as a result of a technological revolution that is completely unprecedented. That's not just it's happening in Greece; it's happening everywhere, and we're frankly struggling as politicians to think about how the division of labor is going to work, how this technology is going to displace existing jobs, what are the skills necessary for the next generation of young kids. When I think about the long-term future, I try to envision what it means for a 6-year-old kid to enter primary school in 2017, and always think that he or she will get out of primary school in 2029, and try to think, what do we teach these kids? How is the world going to be then compared to today? We already know that the basic skills that we teach kids in school today, memorizing stuff, is not particularly helpful when all the information is basically accessible. So if I think about the future in the context that you mentioned, I try to think about a world that is rapidly changing, and at least providing our younger kids with the skills that are necessary to have a chance to thrive in this changing world. Having said that, I think that a lot of the comparative advantages that we have as a country are not that threatened by the technological revolution that is going to take place. The natural beauty of the country, the culture, its geopolitical position, the fact that we are, talented people, and I'll address the issue of the attitudes in a little bit. But I do think we are hardworking, talented people who want the best for the country, and at this point, it's also relatively, unfortunately, you can also hire talent relatively cheaply. These are important comparative advantages upon which we can build. So nothing really more to offer beyond that. But these are important discussions, and they don't usually take place in Greece because we never talk about the sort of longer-term reforms that go beyond the electoral cycle. To your question, I fully understand why a lot of people, young talented people, have left Greece. and I talk to them all the time. I was also, in a different period in my life, someone who was living in London, and was actually, at some point, I went through the dilemma, should I return to Greece or not? And I decided to take a job that was paying significantly less at the time to return to Greece. But, I knew that there was, I thought at least that there was stability, that I was willing to trade even, the sort of money that I was earning here for returning to my homeland, being happy there, and try to build, a productive career starting from a lower base. But the real question is, are there enough opportunities? Is there a real meritocracy? And are people going to be rewarded based on their merit rather than on their connections? And this is clearly not really happening in Greece. Obviously, it's happening much more in the private sector. Huh? The private sector, by nature, is more meritocratic than the public sector. Not fully meritocratic, but certainly more meritocratic. The real challenge is, how do you also change the public sector? But at the end of the day, it's about opportunities. If there are no jobs in Greece, you will not consider returning. You won't even have the option to return. I want to give you the option. The choice is yours then. And we should not forget that we live in a global world. Not everyone is going to return to Greece. And at the end of the day, it's the fact that we have so many people who have the skills and are risk takers to actually leave Greece and find a better future for themselves abroad is also an indication of health. So what I want to give you is I want to give you the option to return. And if you have the option, then it's going to be your call. At the end of the day, it's a deeply personal decision. But I want you to at least have the option. And the option means a decent job with prospects for your career. That's why, at the end of the day, it does come down to jobs. Attitudes. I hear a lot about, the sort of problematic attitudes that we have. And I sort of thought that when I make the broader discussion about values, that this is really what I'm trying to get at. But there are always two sides to the coin. Huh? We should not we should be critical of our responsibilities for what has happened. And I've openly said that the crisis brought about the program, the memoranda, and not the other way around. Because there are still people in Greece who think that it is the other way around, that the crisis is a result of the program. And that's clearly a fantasy. So let's be honest in assessing our responsibilities. Let's look at the hard facts, what really happened. Important to do in a world where facts are always distorted. But at least there's been a lot of literature, I think, which is good, about what really happened in Greece. And most of it follows the sort of same narrative. There isn't much of a revisionist approach to what really happened. We know why we went bankrupt. Of course, attitudes come down, in my mind, to education and role models. Leadership is very important, and I'm not just referring to leadership, the political leadership. There's a lack of leadership in Greece in many fronts. There's a lack of business leadership. I'm afraid to say Greek business people have not done what they should be doing to support the country. They've not invested in the country as much as they should. They were more concerned with their own personal well-being rather than with the overall well-being of their companies or society. Obviously, there are many exceptions, but I'm afraid this is a rule. There's been a lack of leadership amongst the academic world, not as outspoken as we should. At least now, within the university community, we have a lot of people who are outspoken about what is really happening in Greek universities, and that is to be welcomed. So it's not just us, the political leaders. If we create a common narrative, this narrative needs to be supported on many different levels. But we should not forget that this country has struggled to find its place between the East and the West since the Greek Revolution. And it has been a constant struggle. And it's going, sort of to borrow a phrase from a book by Stathis Kalivas, from triumph to disaster, back and forth. And this is what we've been about for 200 years. So let's at least make sure. I cannot predict what will happen in 2050, but let's just make sure that we end this catastrophic period with another sort of big leap forward, because we've done that in our past. And that we should never forget, that we faced incredibly complicated challenges. And that's why I think it is so important that history is taught properly, especially modern Greek history, because we can tell younger people, look, we've had to go through very, very difficult periods. I mean, wars, civil wars, catastrophe back in 1922. And I'm afraid that sometimes we're losing this perspective. One of the good things of having the privilege of having a father who's 99 now, but still around and still active, is that you can actually discuss some of these challenges, and you get a perspective on what sort of difficulties the previous generation had to go through, and they went through momentous tasks. I mean, we had to rebuild the country after a devastating civil war back in 1949, with really deep divisions in Greek society. And in spite of the difficulties and the mistakes, we succeeded. So I think we need to take optimism from these stories, rather than constantly focus on the negative aspect.
Okay, let's take another round of questions. Could we take the lady in the centre here? But can you keep your hand up? I think coming on your right. Yep, it's coming now.
Hi, Vili Kladi. I'm an MSc student at the European Institute. I feel like a lot of the reforms that you already do propose, the cornerstone, at the heart of them, there's administrative reform. And you have a lot of expertise in that area as former Minister of Administrative Reform, but perhaps you can explain it a little bit more, because a lot of what you suggest is an almost intergenerational change. But in regards to actually affecting real change in terms of resistance to change, the degree of unionization in the public sector, in order to actually enact greater efficiency at some point down the line to encourage investment, growth, and so on and so forth, as you discussed already, how exactly do you intend to overcome problems that previous governments have faced? Because these are institutional and they don't necessarily just have to do with how you staff your own party.
Okay, let's take some more. There's a gentleman behind you with the white shirt.
Hello, my name is Stelios Georgoulas. I've been living in London the last 11 years. I want to ask you the following question. The world is changing. Innovation comes in the forefront. Lots of countries around the world are connecting universities with productivity. Also, what is happening, we have in Athens, in the destroyed Athens at the moment, lots of startups which are doing amazingly well. What are you planning? What's your plan? Because I've been to your website, I've been following your campaign, but I don't hear the word innovation nowhere. I don't also hear how you're going to support all these people, because, okay, I know that Greece is a very beautiful country. We know about the culture. We know about all the old school words, but what's about the future? What are you going to do for all this?
Okay, good, thanks. Other questions? The gentleman with the red tie here in the centre.
That's the advantage of having a red tie.
Sorry?
It's the advantage of wearing a red tie.
Thank you, sir. My name is Odysseas Matzionis, and I'm a student in National Academy. I would like to ask you, in the case that you go to the Troika and you propose what you want to propose, then they say you have to do you have to complete the program as it is, as the leftist government has signed it, no matter what. What are you going to do? And could the agreement for safe zones in Syria between Russia, the potential agreement for safe zones in Syria between Russia and the US, be a partial solution to the migration crisis in Greece? And moreover, I would like...
That's fine. I think we've...
Okay, sorry.
We've travelled quite the distance already.
Yeah.
Could we take the lady here, please? And then we're going to come...
Yes, okay, let's try. I'll try to take 5 at a time.
Okay, that's good.
Before I forget what it's... Yeah.
Thank you. Danai Kyriakopoulos. I'm Chief Economist at the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum. Looking beyond the idiosyncrasies of the Greek government, the corruption, the problems that we've had in Greece itself, to what extent do you think that what Greece is going through at the moment has to do with the architecture of the euro? And where would you stand as a future leader of a European country and a Eurozone country on the big debates that are taking place right now in terms of the future of the common currency, more federalism, a pan-European finance minister, etc.? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And then there's a lady to your left here.
Anna Tivtsoglu from the LSE. I would like to stick to a part of your title, Defending the Truth. Do you think that we've seen the truth about the crisis? So my question is, if you were to become the next Prime Minister, what would you do to shed light to the responsibilities about who led us to this crisis? Because already there have been parliamentary committees that have only partially touched on the issue. There's a recent one on the issues of health, public health. But will we ever see justice in this country? Thank you.
Are you suggesting a truth commission, for example? And then, gosh, okay, we'll take the gentleman here, please. Yeah, you.
Hi, I'm George Achilles. My question is, we are in a very nice university, and there is no desk of DAP or PASP or CNE or whatever. What are you going to do to give to the Greek university the position they deserve and to make them the center of research instead of party fights, and clean them from the corruption and everything?
Well done.
Okay, I think you've quite arranged.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go in reverse order. Back in 2011, the two main parties passed a relatively bold law on university reform. One of the decisions taken at the time, which I strongly supported and I've been supporting since 2006, is to remove student sort of organizations from basically participating in the management of universities. And it was the absolutely correct decision taken, because the raison d'etre for CNE, PASP, DAP was exactly that they were, in a sense, co-managing the universities, also creating a lot of corruption and mini-clientelism. We turned the universities into laboratories to train the new clients of the future. Unfortunately, some of these reforms are being rolled back. And Mr. Tsipras actually wants to give again to sort of student organizations the more saying in actually managing the universities, and this would be a complete disaster. The law, we call it the Diamantopoulou law, tried to create a governance structure for universities that would be similar to what you see in most sort of advanced countries, and sort of independent board that actually has a saying in fundraising and in holding sort of the management of the university, the provost accountable. All of this has fizzled out, and it's a real pity. And what one of the first pieces of legislation that we will introduce is an improved version of Law 4009, which was the initial Diamantopoulou law. And I'm not going to back down from this. And I've also made it very clear to our youth organizations that you can be active in universities to sort of promote our ideas, but you're not going to be participating in running the universities. We forget that. That's out of the question. That's not why we have sort of youth organizations. So let's again go in reverse order. We can, after the next elections, we can do two things. We can either spend all our energy in parliamentary committees discussing what has happened in the past, or we can really look into the future and try to make the best use of our time by being as productive as we can. I have stated that the one committee which I would like to set up is a committee that basically looks into what really happened during the first catastrophic 6 months of 2015 and how we almost reached the brink of a complete disaster. If there is, if there is an agreement by all parties involved, we could look at the broader period, historical period, and make an honest assessment of what went right and what went wrong. From the beginning of the crisis or even before that. But I don't really have tremendous faith in these parliamentary committees. They end up being sort of tools in the hands usually of the majority, and that's not really what they're all about. Again, I have more faith in sort of independent sort of researchers, writers, writing about the crisis. There's been tons and tons of books written about the Greek crisis, some of which are actually pretty good. And actually, people do tend to buy them, surprisingly. There's a real interest in trying to understand what happened. So I think as we distance ourselves from the period, I think we'll be able to better understand who is responsible. And again, in politics, there's always a big distinction between the political responsibility, which is basically the responsibility of people when they go to the ballot box, and anything that is relevant to justice. If justice identifies something that needs to be explored, they should be doing their job, no questions asked. And of course, at some point, we need to change the Constitution, as I've advocated since 2006, and get rid of this absurd provision that basically grants ministers immunity 2 years after they leave office. I mean, this is completely unacceptable. Architecture of the Eurozone, I'm very much in line with the proposals that the new French president has made on changing the architecture of the Eurozone. The Eurozone is not sustainable the way it is. It was always problematic in terms of its architecture. We need to make bold movements towards sort of a deepening of the Eurozone that would go just beyond, making the banking union work. I understand these are issues which are sometimes difficult for Germany to discuss, but it's important to have this honest dialogue, and I think that after the German elections, there'll be more traction to actually have this discussion. Safe zones in Syria. I don't think the problem of migration now is much more a problem related to migration coming from Africa and migration coming from Afghanistan or Pakistan. We don't see that many Syrian refugees. That doesn't mean that we don't need to address the Syrian problem, because it is a complete disaster, but it is not necessarily related to the profile of migrants that arrive in Europe these days. I want to make a comment about what Stelios says about startups, because I've spoken a lot about these issues, and if it's not on my website, I need to do something about it, because somebody needs to be held accountable, because I've given tons and tons of speech on this issue, because I spent 7 years of my career in venture capital financing startups at a time when entrepreneurship was not really in vogue in Greece. That was before 2004, when people still felt that it was easier to get a job in the public sector than to set up a startup. This has changed. And there is a booming ecosystem of startups in Greece, which is probably one of the most promising things that has come out of the crisis. What do startups need? Access to capital. We need more venture capital funds. We need more angel investors. We need to convince wealthy Greeks, the shipping community, that it is worthwhile to look at these investors at the very early stage and provide sort of a network of angel investing. There will be several new venture capital funds set up through EIF funding, which is extremely promising. It's probably 400 million euros available for this. But you also need, in my mind, generous tax breaks for new companies during the first 2-3 years of their existence. Simplification of regulatory burdens for new companies. We've already taken a few steps in this direction, especially in terms of setting up a company in Greece. And of course, the big question of social security contributions, which is something which is a problem across the board. But I talk to a lot of young companies that actually lose very talented people, especially talented engineers, to companies abroad. A lot of them go to Cyprus, because the total cost on the company, including social security contributions, is just too big to bear. So we have a very clear sort of strategy, not just a vision, what we want to do with the startup ecosystem. And of course, we need to make it much easier to connect what's happening in universities with what's happening in the real world. There still seems to be a gap. The Greek left still believes that the companies need to be outside universities. I mean, it's an absurd approach coming from another century, which means we also need to streamline issues related to IP, the sort of benefits that a researcher may have if he goes up and sets up his own startup. We just look at what Israel does. It shouldn't be a rocket science, and make sure that we have the proper incentives in place for the university, for the researcher, for the one who provides the private capital. It's not difficult to split the pie in a way that's reasonable for everyone. And last question on administrative reform. It's an issue I feel very passionately about. And obviously there are lots of priorities, and I could talk for hours about this. I'll talk about one issue, which is HR, and how do we manage the HR personnel of the administration. We need performance assessment ASAP. When I introduced performance assessment, there was a huge uproar and almost a revolution, but now it is commonly accepted that you cannot move forward without a proper way to measure performance. We don't need very complicated systems, but at least the ability to distinguish between the true stars, the acceptable civil servants, and those who do not do their job properly would already be a step in the first direction. We need to start from the top and move down towards the bottom. So picking the elite of the administration, the general directors, through a meritocratic process is absolutely critical. We had put in place the legislation, we had started the process, nothing has happened for 2.5 years. I was reading through the program, the memorandum again, the same thing, deadlines to pick the general directors in a meritocratic way. It's almost as if it's Groundhog Day, the same story over and over again. But you cannot implement reforms in public administration without gaining the trust of at least the good civil servants. And the way to do that is to convince them that there's something in it for them, that if they do their job well and if they're appraised through a relatively objective system, they may proceed faster through the ranks and eventually earn more money. So that, in my mind, is absolutely critical. And the other component of administrative reform, which we cannot afford to ignore, is what we call e-government. I gave a detailed presentation at the Confederation of Greek Industries a few days ago on my sort of vision of what e-government really means. There's money available through EU funds. We're way behind. Let's at least use the opportunity to maybe do some leapfrogging and learn from the best on this front. And then, of course, there are lots of other things that have to do with processes. The way, again, you define the confines of the state. What I talked about previously, what should the state be doing? What's the core real activity of the state? What should never be outsourced and what can be outsourced? This is also very much at the core of our approach, including, of course, aggressive mobility. If we cannot hire civil servants, that means that we need to be able to move them from one position to another, retrain them, and use them to basically to serve Greek taxpayers.
Okay, it's been a privilege to have the opportunity of talking with Kyriakos Mitsotakis. I hope very much that you feel that we've covered a good number of topics and a reasonable number of people have been able to ask questions and hear the responses from Kyriakos. I'd like to thank you, as I say, on behalf of the school for coming. And could I pass you this gift? I think, in fact, 2 gifts. Oh. Yes. We have a tradition at the LSE that people like Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton, other people, etc., we're tremendously generous, and we offer them an LSE baseball hat. And I can see that colleagues may have actually left the price tag. So at least it's not second hand.
I can. Let's see.
Very good.
I can try it. Okay. Well, it looks good. So.
And we hope in your office in Singru that you would...
No, we moved from Singru.
Okay.
We're in Piraeus now.
Okay. Yeah. That you would accept this plaque from the LSE to put on your desk as a memento.
Thank you. It was certainly a privilege to participate in this discussion. We were chatting before whether it's more interesting to just give a speech or have a more interactive discussion. I think the second format is better. So again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.